It's sometimes called the Compassionate Father. Now, there are dozens of English translations of the Bible, and each one of them reveals its biases, the biases of the translators. And this is my telling of the story that appears in the Testament of Luke, chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. Rabbi Yeshua of Nazareth was with a group of conservative religious leaders who were criticizing him for welcoming and even eating with marginalized Jews. People like dreaded tax collectors and unclean people like lepers and menstruating women. Yeshua told them 3 stories in a row, and this is the third and longest story. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger went to his father and said, really kind of demanded, "Dad, give me my share of your estate now while I'm still young enough to benefit from it." So the father complied and divided his property. A while later, presumably after he'd sold off land and livestock, the younger son set off for a distant country and then proceeded to waste his wealth by living recklessly. He had nothing left when a drought hit the country and famine followed. Hungry and broke, he hired himself out to a neighboring farmer. One day he was feeding carob bean pods to some pigs, and he thought, "These pigs eat better than I do. And my father's servants have more than enough food, and here I am starving to death." So he thought, "I'll return to my father and I'll say, 'I have sinned against you. I am not worthy to be your son, but please let me work for you as a servant.'" And immediately he headed off toward his homeland. And while he was approaching, but still a good distance away, his father saw him and was filled with such joy and compassion that the father ran to him, threw his arms around him, hung about his neck, and kissed him, then accompanied him through the village to the farm. When they arrived home, the son said, "I have sinned against you. I am not worthy to be your son." But the father called to his servants and said, "Bring the best robe for my son. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Slaughter the fattened calf for a feast and a celebration. My son was dead, but he is alive again. He was lost, but now he's found." Now, while all of this was happening, the oldest son was out in the field working. He came near the house and he heard the music and the laughter inside, so he grabbed one of the nearby servants who told him, "Your brother has returned and your father has killed the fattened calf because he's safe and sound." The older brother got angry and refused to go inside, so the father went outside and pleaded with him to come in and join the festivities. But the older brother wasn't having it. He said, "Look, all these years I've stayed here, slaving for you, always obeying you, and you've never given me so much as a goat so that I could have a party with my friends. But this other son of yours, he shows up after squandering your property on wine and women, and you kill the fattened calf for him." The father said, "My son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we must celebrate. Your brother was dead, and now he is alive again. He was lost, and he is found." Please rise now as you're willing and able, and open the gray hymnal to number 323. Break not the circle. Adams is a Christian theologian who believes that modern readers miss a lot of nuance in the Bible because we don't really understand the context of the times. In his book, The Prostitute in the Family Tree, he argues that not understanding context makes us miss a lot of the humor that people in the Middle East would have understood 2,000 years ago or so. And here's one example. Judea in those days was a culture of primogeniture. Everything goes to the oldest son. Now, there are 2 rules of primogeniture. The first rule is never split up an estate. An estate could support a whole extended family. You, your parents, your sons, their wives and children, your servants and their families. If you hold the estate, you are responsible to all of those people, and you live as one extended family, one community with one great pool of resources. But if you divided it between your 5 kids, let's say, they'd each be on their own, and they wouldn't have enough to support their extended families. And then if they divided it among their children, the plots would be even smaller and provide less livelihood. And after a few generations, you'd have a bunch of little quarter lots like a subdivision. Lots too small to support any family. Now, the second rule of primogeniture is never share ownership, because that would lead to even worse chaos. Ask anyone who owns a beach cottage with 15 siblings and cousins, and you'll understand. They can tell you what happens. The property is likely to end up in disrepair because the great-grandchildren can't agree on how to make improvements or repairs. So it languishes until nobody can stand it anymore, and the town is threatening to tear it down. So when Yeshua first told the story of the prodigal son, or the compassionate father, he didn't need to explain any of that to anyone. His listeners understood that so completely that they would have laughed out loud at the very idea of a son making such an outrageous request. It was unthinkable. And when the father went ahead and divided the estate, they would have laughed even louder at the actions of such a fool. The thing is that the story is part of a quick succession of 3 stories that Yeshua tells to demonstrate God's love. Remember, he's being criticized for accepting people for who they are, meeting them where they are. Now, the first story is about a shepherd with 100 sheep. One of them goes missing, so he leaves the other 99 to find the one. Foolish. The next story is about a woman who neglects her responsibilities and tears her house apart looking for 2 misplaced coins. Coins that were almost worthless. Of course, kind of ironic considering, all these coins. Sometimes it's worth it. In their day, both of these stories made people laugh out loud. They really did. But the point that Yeshua was trying to make is that God loves his children so completely and unconditionally that it's silly, foolish, reckless. And that's pretty funny when you think about it. Douglas Adams points out a couple other things that I find really interesting. First is that when he's feeding the neighbor's pigs, the son thinks, I'll go to my father, I'll tell him I've sinned against him and that I'm not worthy of being his son, and I'll ask him to treat me as one of his servants. But then his father does something utterly amazing. His father meets him, walks proudly with him through the village so that the son won't be tormented by the people he passes. After all, he must have had a reputation of being horrible. People in those days were harsh. They would have jeered at him. They would have thrown things at him. He would not have been welcomed back, but the father foolishly accompanied him, recklessly accompanied him. So when the father does that, the son thinks, I guess I don't have to be treated like a servant after all. He just says, I've sinned against you and I'm not worthy of being your son. So he gets the credit for being humble without having to give anything up, because that would have been really foolish. So here's the part that I find really, really interesting about this story. It has to do with the line, he wasted his life by living recklessly. The original Greek text is best translated as he wasted his substance or essence by living asotos. That's a Greek word that means prodigally. He lived as a prodigal. Which begs the question, what does prodigal mean? Now, the dictionaries define prodigal as characterized by profuse or wasteful expenditure. Recklessly spendthrift. Like the word prodigious, meaning plentiful, The word prodigal comes from the Latin prodigus, meaning lavish. And in that sentence, wealth is the same as substance or essence, spirit, life force. So the father gave his substance away, and the son squandered his essence, his substance, recklessly by spending wastefully. So what does it mean to spend wastefully? He could have bought more land or more house than he could afford. He might have bought way too much seed or overpaid for an overabundance of livestock that his land couldn't support. He could have done anything that overextended his finances and made him vulnerable when the drought and subsequent famine hit. The thing is, we don't know. Yeshua didn't tell anyone that part of the story. So why, when he went home, did his older brother get so angry? Well, his older brother was convinced that the younger brother had blown it all on wine and women. How could he possibly have known that? When the younger son left, he was so far away and so far out of touch as to be dead to the family and community that he left behind. Obviously, they weren't in touch. All we know is that the younger son said to his father, "I have sinned against you." Of course he did. He didn't say, "I have lived a sinful life." The older son assumed what his younger brother had been up to. He had a whole story in his head, one in which he was the good son, the responsible martyr who stayed behind and sacrificed his own happiness selflessly, dutifully, while his other brother lived a life of selfish debauchery. The funny part is, it seems like most people must identify with the older brother in the story. I say this because I looked up the translations of verse 13. He wasted his wealth by living recklessly. In all 63 translations available on BibleGateway.com. I read all 63 translations. Now, a lot of those translations use the word reckless or foolish, but most of them use words like wild, riotous, immoral, extravagant, even debauched, perverted. Two books translate asotos as spending his money on parties and prostitutes. Isn't that amazing? Asotos means to spend recklessly, and they translate it as spending on parties and prostitutes. So the Living Bible, which was a personal favorite of Billy Graham and is still distributed to evangelicals, is one of those Bibles. And the Catholic Living Bible, with an introduction by Pope John Paul II, is the other. So evangelicals and Roman Catholics, two of the largest religious groups in the country, seem to see this story from the perspective of the older brother. And the message is the one that I heard growing up in the Catholic Church. People who stay on the farm with the family are good, and people who who leave do so because they want to live sinful lives. Now, that may not have been what the priests and the nuns and teachers were saying to me, but that was how I heard the story because of the translation. And maybe I'm just taking it all too personally. I mean, like many of you, I am the sibling in my family who left. Wow. That's amazing. So for folks at home, we have a chipmunk running around the sanctuary. Oh my goodness. That's cute. Okay, so the chipmunk went out the front door. Everything's cool now. Boy, that was a first. So we all calm now? Okay. So maybe I'm taking it too personally. I mean, like many of you, I'm the one in my family who left. I'm the sibling in my family who moved across the country while my brothers, one older and one younger, stayed behind and took over the family business. Now, I know they have a lot of assumptions about me and about what happened in San Francisco. And they're wrong assumptions. But the thing is, I have assumptions too about what happened as they stayed in Connecticut. And I bet they're just as wrong. The thing is, because I identify with the younger brother, I don't think that he was an innocent victim. What he did was wrong. I mean, he basically went to his father, his very much alive father, and said, "You're dead to me, old man. I need your wealth more than I do. I don't care about the rest of the people that you're responsible for. I want my share." I mean, his words and his deeds were so harsh that they cut him off from his family. He was dead to them, and they were dead to him. He had no right to demand anything of his father, who after all was alive and still needed those resources that he had built. But neither of the brothers was perfect. But I think the tension and distrust are really reflective of the tension and distrust that surround us these days. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I talk to whose families are fractured and distant. Families that don't speak to each other. My own family. I mean, it's everywhere. It's an epidemic. Our biggest political tensions are no longer between red states and blue states, but rather between conservative, more homogeneous rural areas and liberal, more diverse urban areas. And both sides make assumptions about each other. It's gotten to the point where red and blue don't even use the same language. On one side, the father is compassionate. On the other side, the younger son is debauched and perverted. And we're all making assumptions about each other all the time, often wrong assumptions, probably without even realizing that we're doing it. In the meantime, we're completely missing the point of all three stories Yeshua told that day. It's possible for parents to so love their children that they'll be welcomed home no matter what. A shepherd can have such a sense of commitment to all the sheep he cares for that he'll risk everything to save the one that is at the most risk. And everyone has so much worth and dignity, so much value that we should put aside everything that we're doing in order to find those who are lost. Now, personally, I don't believe in an all-knowing Father God. I believe that God is a kind of shorthand for the perfectly imperfect force of creation and destruction that lives within each of us and binds one to all living things. But maybe what we need to do is to put aside our assumptions, stop judging each other so harshly, and figure out what the lessons are in any conflict. And of course, as I say this, I'm aware that there are people in this country who are literally preparing for civil war. If their candidate is not elected in November, they will take to the streets with all of their weapons and do what they need to do in order to get what they want. They are the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, and the people who still support them as heroes. And I also know that they are a minority. They are the angry, heavily armed minority claiming to have a moral God on their side, but they are a minority. And the only way that we are going to keep them from becoming successful is if we actually talk to the majority, the people who are closer to the middle, the people who don't want war, the people less likely to listen to the stories the conservative media is pushing about baby killers and child pornographers and the deep state murder of a guy named Benghazi. That guns are the only thing that will keep traditional families safe from the excesses of others. The thing is, we're all like those brothers. We're all like both of those brothers. We each want what we want and feel like we're right. Sometimes we come off as harsh and self-serving to others, and most of the time we feel like martyrs in the process. But mostly we make up stories about each other, or worse, take tales of a few and make them about everyone that we don't agree with. Each of us just has to stop being like the older brother or the younger brother. I think we need to be a bit more like the father. Foolishly, wildly, recklessly, generously forgiving. We need to hold actual criminal minority accountable while finding the connections with the peaceful minority. We have more commonality than differences. And a lot of those commonalities may, surprisingly, exist in the Bible. So may we know it a little better so we can meet people where they are. May it be so. Please rise now as we sing together